Our next panel is Politics and Strategy of Virginia's Abolition. The moderator will be Professor Engel. The panelists are Doug Ramsor, Michael Stone, and Rita Davis. Doug Ramsor is the founder of the Ram Law Firm PLLC, a criminal litigation firm in Richmond, Virginia. Previously, Doug served as the capital defender for the Central Virginia and Southeastern Virginia, where he has been responsible for defending people charged with capital murder in more than 80 jurisdictions throughout Virginia. Doug has been lead counsel for more than 30 people charged with the death penalty offense in Virginia and Georgia, and has been designated learned counsel in federal death penalty cases across the country. Doug is an adjunct professor at the University of Richmond Law School, a past president of the Virginia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and a teaching faculty for the National College of Capital Voir Dire in Boulder, Colorado. He was honored with the Bill Geimer Award by Washington and Lee's Capital Defense Clinic. Doug is a graduate of James Madison University and the University of Richmond School of Law. Michael Stone is the executive director of Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Prior to his position, he worked as a field organizer for the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. In that role, he worked with abolition organizations in Virginia, Missouri, South Dakota, and Pennsylvania. Michael has spoken about capital punishment to faith communities and other organizations across the Commonwealth. He has also identified opponents to the death penalty among unlikely allies, including political conservatives and murder victim families. Michael has also worked for 25 years in social ministry for the Office of Justice and Peace for the Catholic Diocese of Richmond from 1984 to 2009. In that position, he was Diocesan Respect Life Coordinator for that 25-year period. Michael earned Bachelor of Science degrees in Economics and Urban Planning from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and an MA degree in Pastoral Ministry from Boston College. He is a former board member of the Virginia Catholic Conference, the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, and the Richmond Peace Education Center. Michael has worked on issues as diverse as economic justice, affordable housing, abortion, stem cell research, assisted suicide, globalization, fair trade, immigration reform, capital punishment, and social responsibility investment. Rita Davis is originally from Bedford County and majored in English at Washington and Lee University. After graduation, she spent 3.5 years as a police officer with the Lynchburg City Police Department. Ms. Davis left the police department to attend the University of Richmond School of Law, where she graduated magna cum laude. Ms. Davis then clerked for the Honorable Richard S. Arnold on the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. After her clerkship, Ms. Davis joined the Richmond office of Hunt and Andrews Kurth as a complex commercial litigator. After 15 years with the firm and a promotion to counsel, Ms. Davis joined the Office of the Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Virginia as Section Chief for Trials in the Civil Litigation Division. She's supervised a team of 21 attorneys defending the Commonwealth in civil, employment law, and workers' compensation litigation. In January 2018, Ms. Davis was appointed as the counsel to Governor Ralph S. Northam, and she was the first woman to be appointed to this position. In August of 2021, Ms. Davis joined the Department of Defense as Deputy General Counsel at the Pentagon, where responsibilities include providing legal advice and services in a broad array of privacy, counterintelligence, security plans and programs, voting assistance, standards of conduct, investigative matters, and complex litigation. Now that all the panelists have been introduced, I'll turn things over to Professor Engel.
Great, thank you. And if we can make sure that screen sharing is enabled, I know that a couple of our speakers have some images that they want to put up, so that would be great. Also, I see that my name is displaying as Bernadette Donovan. I'm not sure how I got that particular promotion, but I'll take it. It is me, however. And I am very excited to hear from our trio of speakers on this panel to discuss the politics of abolition and how that came to fruition last year. In sort of discussing and preparing for this presentation, a few phrases kept coming up, which are sort of like perfect storm and alignment of the stars and the planets. And it really was, I think, a whole host of issues coming together to create the possibility for legislative repeal last year. And nobody knows more about those particular stars and how they aligned than our trio of panelists here. So we are going to start with Doug, who's going to talk about the role of the Capital Defender offices and laying the groundwork for repeal. We're then going to hear from Michael Stone, who really, as the director of VADP, was the tip of the spear in lobbying for repeal amongst a whole host of other legislative prerogatives that had been advanced over the years. And then we will hear from Rita Davis, who is in a unique position to really give us a look at the sort of behind the scenes politics of how repeal became a possibility and ultimately came to fruition when it did. So I will turn things over to Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate those being here. I got to say what an honor it is to speak alongside such a distinguished group of folks at this symposium. Frankly, some people who were my personal heroes, and I'm just honored to be here. I've had the benefit of being involved in the creation of really early on in the creation. I didn't create them, but being there in statewide capital defender offices in 2 different states, in Virginia and in Georgia. And I've seen just how transformational those offices were in both those places. And so kind of what I want to do, I think, is just talk a little bit about how I think those offices affect things, what we were able to do through our representation of clients. I will say personally, it was my greatest honor of my career to have been a part of the capital defender offices, to be trusted with representing so many people who faced the possible death sentence. And I'm honored to represent the people who were part of those offices here. I may talk about, please forgive me if I use the term I really mean we, because it was a team effort of lawyers, investigators, mitigation specialists, and staff people. And I want to talk about that a little bit more as we go through here. But I think the capital defender offices really turned out to be the most disruptive effect on the machinery of death in Virginia as anything that we had to help really bring about its demise ultimately. I joined the Capital Defender's Office in Virginia, this office of the Central Virginia Capital Defender, in 2002, and spent the next 17 years of my career doing nothing but defending death penalty cases in Virginia and also in Georgia, where I spent several years between 2006 and 2009. I spent 4 years in Georgia defending them. And then I came back in 2009 to lead the Office of Capital Defender for Southeastern Virginia and ultimately the office in Central Virginia. And I will say, we had some sort of mottos and mantras for our office for what we saw our workers doing. And one of those was that we were abolishing the death penalty 1 case at a time for every one of our clients. And that's how we saw the work we did as part of a larger cause for what we were doing, but doing it through representation of each single person as it went through. We saw ourselves as giving poor people a rich person's defense. That was a big part of what we were trying to do, was to show that this representation mattered, that even though our clients were indigent, they deserved the very best possible representation. I think if you understand, back before the capital defender offices first came into being, Virginia was an incredibly hospitable environment. And I apologize if I say a lot of the things that you've been hearing in this symposium already. I may repeat myself with some of these brilliant panelists, but Virginia was just a place that was ripe for people to get to death sentences. It was, you had court-appointed lawyers whose pay was abysmally low, cases that proceeded extremely quickly to trial. There was no right to ex parte funding for experts, for investigators, for anybody. You had to do all that in open court. There was no right to see police reports. There was no right to get a witness list before trial, witness statements. There was no right in the beginning to have even notice of who the experts for the Commonwealth were going to be. You had aggravators that were incredibly broad, future dangerousness aggravators that were ultimately found to be that the issue wasn't whether the person was capable of committing future violence, but whether they were inclined mentally to do it. You couldn't present expert testimony against future dangerousness. Incredibly broad depravity of mind aggravators in which any kind of murder could really justify for it. And then really not much in the way of statutory mitigators. You had lawyers who had been brought along to look at the statutes and decide that was how they were supposed to defend cases, and the statutory mitigators were practically meaningless on their face. And then when you had folks who did get sentenced to death, you had a lack of really meaningful appellate review, which meant that Virginia was just this state in which the machinery of death was humming along quite nicely, and it's how they liked it. But there were a couple of hiccups that happened. There was the innocence case of Earl Washington that got a lot of publicity. There was concerns around the country about innocence movements and what was happening. And then some studies that were being done in Virginia about the inadequacies of its capital defense system. And the powers that be in Virginia, though, did not want to let its long history, the longest in the since the colonization of the states, to go away. They wanted to continue that process. And so when a study was done in 2002 that showed by the Judicial Legislative Audit and Review Commission about capital defense and what was going on with the defense of those cases in Virginia, they seized on that then to say, well, we're going to put what I think they expected to be window dressing on the death penalty system. We're going to try to show that we give adequate constitutional representation to these criminal defendants before we execute them. Okay. The study that came out in 2002 by JLARC showed that, in fact, they'd been getting incredibly inadequate representation for this. You had, of the lawyers who were representing people who were sentenced to death, a whopping 24% of the attorneys who'd handled a capital case in the previous 5 years in Virginia had been disciplined by the Virginia State Bar, right? You saw these really inadequate lawyers who were there, who were doing it. Most people didn't have a problem with that because the execution rate was enormous. Between 76 and 2004, Virginia tried 166 capital defendants. 140 of them were sentenced to death. A death sentencing rate of 84% was really high that way. But one of the things that the JLARC study did say was that this was also going to be a cost savings, potentially, right? Virginia was spending $1.5 to $2 million per year on court-appointed capital defense, and the legislators really thought this might maximize cost savings if we went with these specialized capital defender units. And so, in fact, the study originally suggested that there should be 6 regional capital defender offices. General Assembly wasn't happy with that. They cut that number down to 4, and originally each office was staffed with 3 lawyers, a capital defender, deputy capital defender, an assistant capital defender, and then an investigator, a mitigation specialist, and 1 support staff. So 6 people in each of those offices. And the idea was that then those would make our system look like it was fair and better. And I don't think anyone expected what really happened, which is once we were able to establish this team environment in Virginia, it took off with dedicated lawyers who focused just on capital defense. I joined the office in Central Virginia as the deputy capital defender in 2002. And what immediately happened was this everyday work environment where you're constantly in the office next to the mitigation specialist, next to the attorney that's there. You start to work through those problems in a better way. As a lawyer who's done this, as both a public defender and as a private practice lawyer, it's just so much easier to just walk next door and talk to that person and have them available every day. And that those ideas that work together really, I think, had just a multiplicative effect upon how we did everything else past that. Those offices were really innovative in that they had mitigation specialists and investigators on staff, which was so new for what we're doing. And I'll talk about that a little more if I can. And then we started working on our motions practice that we began amping up. We began learning by going to national conferences around the country and doing specialized training. What were those things that were happening in other places? What were the places that Virginia was less fair? When I first was doing capital defense, I had some cases in private practice before I joined the capital defender's office. Private lawyers would get a CD of motions from VC3. That was the standard form motions that have been put together, I assume, by Roger Groot or somebody else. And most of those lawyers would just change the style of the case and they'd file those motions. And you'd have maybe one afternoon where you'd have about an hour and a half of motions, most of what the lawyers would just submit to the court because they're preserving their appellate record, but no real meaningful motions practice that was happening there. And we began litigating these systemic issues that were there. The lack of ex parte funding was one of those big things. I remember having a DNA case that was based solely on DNA. And I asked the judge for a DNA expert, and he said, you could just talk to the state's expert. They're independent. Like, well, they're the ones who did the testing, right? And they wouldn't allow me to do that. We began doing those things. One of the biggest things, I think, in the capital defender's offices was that we were no longer under the influence of the trial judge, who previously was the person who would appoint the lawyers in the case. They would appoint them, they would approve their bills, they would approve any of the funding in the case, right? And frankly, when the judge is the person who pays you, that's the person that feels like your client to those private lawyers, right? Who needed to have those cases to help their own business for what was there. The capital defender's office didn't need that anymore. We were required to be appointed to these cases, and it didn't matter if we were going to upset the judge or what was going to happen there. There's many great lawyers who served as capital defenders in Virginia. But if you've ever met David Ball or Ed Varsity, 2 of my predecessors, you know they have zero interest in pleasing the judge, right? They see it, frankly, as a badge of honor when the judge is unhappy with them and feel like they're not doing their job if it's not that way. I think, Joe Flood pointed out earlier some of the grand jury litigation that had happened. It's not easy to go in front of a judge and say, Judge, I think you're being racially discriminatory, right? And look them in the face. Professor Engel and I had the pleasure of trying what ended up being the last capital murder trial in Virginia history before the abolition of the death penalty in Virginia. And in that case, we did some litigation around a portrait of Robert E. Lee that was in the courtroom where our African-American client was to be tried on a death penalty case. A portrait that had stood there in that courtroom, life-size portrait of Robert E. Lee for 110 years, facing the judge, the most prominent thing in the entire courtroom. And we filed a motion challenging the presence of that in a place where our client's life was on the line, and went through the history of that. I cannot imagine a private lawyer who was going to be appointed by the court and live in that jurisdiction feeling comfortable raising that kind of challenge. And how do I know that? Because no one had done it for 110 years before we got there. But we litigated that and ultimately resulted in that portrait being removed. Our client went to trial in a courtroom that didn't have that portrait, and he was acquitted of the murder charges that were against him and freed. Those are the kinds of institutional things that we could do because we were no longer relying on the largesse of the judge, right? We could fight more to keep the, oh, there's a picture of it, the before. We could fight those battles that were unpopular. And frankly, we would play that pretty regularly. I would tell my local lawyers, because we would always have normally a local private lawyer who's appointed as co-counsel with us, you guys go be the good cop. We'll be the bad cop. You tell those prosecutors, you know, we're more trouble than we're worth, and just let us get out of the way for what's there. We had unlimited investigative services. We had cases where we listened to jail phone calls. We interviewed every witness. These were things before that private lawyers had to beg for crumbs in order to get there. And we were able to do that really regularly. And I can't overemphasize the importance of those mitigation experts on staff who frankly taught the lawyers how to be better at dealing with clients. The biggest success that the Capital Defender's Office had was not in the trials we won, but in the trials we prevented from happening. And that was because we were able to work to get plea agreements through aggressive motions practice, through showing that we're talented trial lawyers. But getting a plea offer from a prosecutor is really only half of the battle. The other part is getting your client to take it. And I really think fundamentally the Capital Defender's Offices were successful because we built relationships with our clients that allowed us to then get plea agreements for them, that allowed us to convince our clients that agreeing to spend the rest of their life in prison is the best thing that can happen for them. That's not easy to do, but that's most of what we were able to do through working through their stories, showing that we were willing to fight for them, but ultimately that was the best thing. You know, I think when we look at how many cases were going to trial, how many cases were resulting in death sentences, 84% of them before the creation of the Capital Defender's Offices. And suddenly after 2004, 2005, when the Capital Defender's Offices came, those numbers just plummeted. They just didn't exist anymore. That part of that was because we were preventing those trials, and then we were winning the trials when we got to them. When we look back at the legacy a bit here of these Capital Defender Offices, we see that they, very, very few of them ever resulted in any clients ever receiving a death sentence, right? The Northern Virginia Capital Defender's Office, by my count and recollection, only ever had 2 clients that got death sentences recommended by juries, Ivan Telegoose and Mark Lawler. Telegoose ultimately gets a pardon or gets a commutation from the governor. Mark Lawler gets relief and his case overturned in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, where they were astounded at how poorly Virginia was implementing laws around future dangerousness, and then gets a life sentence as a result. The Southeastern Capital Defender only had Thomas Porter, who ultimately is on death row when the death penalty gets abolished and gets the commutation of life because of that. The Central Capital Defender's Office, I arguably was involved in the Ricky Gray case. You know, none of their lawyers were actually at trial on it because of staffing issues that were at play there, but they had been involved earlier in it somewhat. And Ricky Gray ends up being the only person ever represented by Capital Defender's Office who gets executed. Of the entire history of those offices, only one person. The Southwestern Capital Defender's Office never had a single person executed during or even recommended for a death sentence during the time they were there. And that's more astonishing because they had more cases than any other office, probably by a factor of 2. And they were able to keep all of them from being there. Ultimately, I think that we succeeded in that mission that we had of abolishing the death penalty one case at a time. What we saw was Senator Dick Saslaw, who longtime Democratic opponent of the of abolition of the death penalty in Virginia. he was always in favor of the death penalty. He was a person who'd been for it in the beginning, regularly shot down any measure to abolish it. Ultimately, when abolition passes, he changes his vote. And he says the reason why he did that is because he saw the Ronald Hamilton case in Virginia, which was the last case that got tried with death on the table in Prince William County, the Northern Virginia Capital Defender's Office in Eden Varsky. And that case was a police officer killed on her first day in duty, in the line of duty. And a jury ultimately ends up in a life sentence for that. And Senator Sasslaw says, if you can't get it in that case, we don't need it anymore. You know, I had another sort of rule in my capital defender offices, which was you could never talk about our caseloads outside the office because it never worked out. You know, if we had 50 cases, people would have still thought it was not enough for us to be working on. But ultimately, I had that rule for a while at the end because we were running out of cases. And I don't think people realized just how the faucet of new death penalty cases that came along had begun to dry up after we started giving good representation. Prosecutors were not charging as much because frankly, the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze anymore. They knew they were going to fight against a group of specialized, hardcore attorneys, right, who were going to have the better staff than they were, have more time to work on their cases than they would, and it just wasn't worth it for them anymore. We were running out of things to do by the end, is ultimately what was there. So I think what we ended up proving was just how, frankly, illegitimate the death penalty system had been previously in Virginia. We made it clear that the death penalty didn't go to the worst offenders, but it went to those with the worst lawyers. And that when you gave competent and dedicated representation, the death penalty just withered on the vine. And that's how I think we ultimately met our goal in that system of saying we're going to end this death penalty one case at a time. There were no more people. And there were a lot of folks who were able to say there hadn't been a new death sentence in Virginia in 8 years. There hadn't been anyone executed in a while. There were only 2 people in Virginia's death row at the time of abolition. And I think those things were all due in large part to the great work that was done by the folks in the Capital Defender's Office and how we worked hard to provide that. And that's why I'm so happy that I was able to be a part of it. And I think they're super important. Thank you for listening to me out on that.
Thank you, Doug. That's fantastic. And thank you particularly for your tip of the hat to all the wonderful investigators and mitigation specialists who we were privileged to work with over the years. I do want to encourage folks to drop questions in the Q&A box. I see that Professor Lane has already dropped one in. We will turn to questions once all the panelists have spoken, but we appreciate you dropping those there. So I will keep an eye on those as we go forward. So let me turn things over now to Michael to talk about the advocacy that went into the repeal effort.
Thanks, Matthew. It's great to be with you and the other panelists and to be part of the symposium. I'm going to be sharing my screen here for a PowerPoint. And let's see. Okay, hopefully you're all seeing that. Yeah, Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty was formed in 1991 when a group of citizens decided that there needed to be an organization dedicated solely to capital punishment. Over its 30-year history, VADP has focused on 3 areas: public education, organizing advocates, and public policy advocacy. And as I'm sure you've heard during the symposium, Virginia, going back to the earliest days of the founding, of its founding in 1608, we were the first state to execute anyone in the New World. And we have the history of executing more people in our history than any other part of the United States. Now, I think it's important to understand that VADP and the litigators and capital defenders are one part of a much bigger national strategy to end the death penalty. It's a combined litigation and issue advocacy effort that is focused on ending the death penalty through repeal in critical mass of states, stopping the use of the death penalty in the states that still have the death penalty, and just driving down the number of death sentences and executions nationwide. Currently, 23 states and the District of Columbia have abolished capital punishment, most recently us in Virginia last year. 12 more states have not had an execution in the past 10 years. That means 2/3 of the states have effectively ended use of the death penalty. The national strategy is focused in increasing the number of states that have abolished, keeping death sentences under 40 a year, keeping executions carried out nationwide under 30 a year, and keeping at least 5 to 10 states in the de facto repeal column. In other words, keeping them from reinstating executions. And finally, driving media coverage to undermine public confidence in the death penalty, showing that it's not an effective response to violence, that the system that we have is broken beyond repair, and that it is an essential element of racial justice in this country. Already, the use of the death penalty has gotten to be rare in the sense that when you look at these numbers, under 30, under 40, when there are 14,000 murders, unfortunately, that happen in this country in a single year. Now, this final goal of messaging is crucially important because it builds public opinion that can result in legislative victories. If public opinion is not with us, we don't have a hope of getting legislators to end capital punishment. And here the key message is that all of us across the country are reiterating time and time again. We have the danger of executing an innocent person. And in Virginia, we have the story of Earl Washington, but there are also at least a dozen other people who were convicted of murder that have been exonerated, that were not sentenced to death in the last 20 years. It's important for us to keep mentioning time and time again that the death penalty is rooted in our history of racial oppression, lynching, and racial bias. That the long capital process that has been instituted can and does cause harm to the family members of murder victims. It prolongs their suffering in many, many respects and causes additional trauma. The death penalty is enormously expensive and diverts resources away from policies that have been proven, that have been shown, that helps public safety. And finally, that ending the death penalty is an essential element in achieving meaningful and comprehensive criminal justice reform. VADP has been following this playbook for many, many years. In its early years, VADP could do little but rail against the manifest unfairness of the state's capital system. We sponsored countless educational events across the Commonwealth featuring unlikely allies like murder victim family members, death row exonerees, and the former chief executioner here in Virginia, Jerry Gibbons, who was once a member of our board of directors before he passed away from COVID-19 a little over a year ago. We organized vigils on the nights of executions, first at the state penitentiary, then at Greensville Correctional Center. Our supporters across the Commonwealth organized vigils in another 10 to 15 localities around the state. The ADP worked very closely with media to provide compelling human stories, as well as data and research into how Virginia was imposing the death penalty in an arbitrary and capricious manner that was rife with racial bias. Over time, we came to understand that we needed to be more strategic in our educational and outreach work. And thanks to some funding from two groups of religious, Catholic religious orders, women religious, we were able to hire Dale Brumfield as a full-time field organizer. His sole job for years was to provide educational programs in conservative parts of the state where VADP had very little support. He was relentless in building relationships with libertarians and Republicans and converting many of them to the abolition cause, signing up literally hundreds of conservatives around the state to VADP and having them join in our advocacy work. Doug has spoke eloquently about the remarkable work of capital defense attorneys, mitigation specialists, and investigators in this victory. And I just want to show this chart. This shows the number of murders in blue in Virginia year to year, and then showing the trend of death sentences just before and then after the establishment of these regional capital representation centers. Death sentences dropped over 90% since the establishment of those centers. It's just a really remarkable victory, remarkable record. And it would have been politically impossible for us to even discuss reform of the death penalty, much less abolition, with the legislators without their extraordinary work. Now, the work in the legislature has not been straightforward. It's been a real process. Starting in 2015, VADP worked with the mental health community to promote legislation to exempt people with severe mental illness, or SMI for short, from the death penalty. Now, this limited reform measure gave us the opportunity to discuss the many problems in our capital system with supporters of the death penalty. If we had come in 2015 saying we wanted to talk to Republicans about abolition, we probably wouldn't have gotten a meeting. But saying that we had this very limited reform gave us an opening, a crack in the door to meet with them and their staffs, and to, in a sense, in that process, undermine their confidence in the capital system by talking about the many problems in Virginia. And we built support over time. In fact, the Virginia Senate passed our SMI bill in 2019 and again in 2020, first by a 23-16 margin, then by an overwhelmingly bipartisan 32-7 margin. In that year, 12 of the 19 Republican senators voted in support of the SMI exemption. That was really an extraordinary victory. Unfortunately, we were never able to get any traction in the House of Delegates, where chairs of the Courts of Justice Committee just refused to allow the bill to be heard or considered in a serious manner. Again, in 2020, we passed the SMI bill, and that same year was the first year we introduced a bill to abolish the death penalty in well over a decade, because we didn't want to introduce one and have it laughed out of the legislature. We only wanted to bring it forward when we thought we had enough bipartisan support to have a serious conversation. Unfortunately, it just was not heard seriously in 2020. So we knew we had a lot of work to do getting ready for the 2021 legislative session. Thankfully, we had two excellent patrons in the House and the Senate for our abolition bill, Senator Scott Surville and Delegate Mike Mullen. Now, our task is at VADP was to develop an accurate vote count for the committees in both the House and the Senate that would have to pass the measure, as well as for the entire chamber. Thankfully, we didn't have to do this alone. It wasn't just Dale and me. We had our traditional partners, the Virginia Catholic Conference, the ACLU of Virginia, as well as the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, working very closely with us and helping us with those vote counts and meetings with legislators. Now, an enormous factor was the focus on racial justice reform. The entire nation became transfixed by the police murder of George Floyd. People could see with their own eyes an example of the fatal use of government power against a Black man. When protests against police abuses erupted across Virginia and around the nation, legislators who formerly were very reluctant to talk about criminal justice reform or death penalty abolition suddenly embraced those in the face of that widespread public protest. And VADP spoke as loudly and as clearly as we could, time and time again with the media, that any reform effort had to include abolition of the death penalty. Our board chair, Christina Leslie, a former Capitol defender, had her superb op-ed published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And I want to quote from it because I think it's really an important message that we gave to every legislator with whom we met. And I quote, "The recent murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, and too many others, disturbingly, are similar to the thousands of documented lynchings that occurred in the United States from the Reconstruction era through World War II. For generations, this country's failure to effectively combat or even confront systemic racism has resulted in the brutal, discriminatory treatment of Black and brown people. Nowhere is racial bigotry more insidious than in the application of America's harshest punishment, death. Capital defendants in the Commonwealth are restrained by waist chains and leg irons while seated in the courtroom, adorned with portraits commemorating men of the Confederacy. Typically, the judge, prosecutors, and defense attorneys are all white. As a Black lawyer, I am profoundly aware that my client and I are the only minorities in the room. All killings, particularly those carried out by the state in a biased manner, dilute the morality of society as a whole. Meaningful and equitable criminal justice reform born in the wake of recent police murders of Black Americans and subsequent protests must include abolishing the death penalty." Unquote. So we had some very powerful messaging that we brought into individual virtual meetings with over 50 members of the General Assembly. Virginia Podboy, our extraordinary lobbyist, Dale Brumfield, and I had phone calls or Zoom meetings with a wide range of legislators, avid supporters, some skeptics, and fewer opponents than we anticipated. Even those who expressed reluctance to vote for abolition were really with us in their hearts. They just needed reassurance that a vote to end the death penalty would not hurt them back in their home districts. Later polling conducted by the ACLU of Virginia and Christopher Newport University helped to alleviate some of those concerns about negative blowback. After each of those legislative meetings, we updated our online vote chart. By December, it was clear that we had the votes to pass the abolition bill in both the House Courts of Justice Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee. But the vote count for the House and Senate floors were way too close for comfort. We got an extraordinary boost for our cause early in January 2021. Just before dinner one night at home, I got a phone call from our lobbyist. Virginia told me, "Are you sitting down? The governor is going to endorse death penalty abolition in the State of the Commonwealth address." She told me that the governor's staff had requested information. The next day, I got the information together, sent it to our lobbyist to forward to the governor's office. A few days later, Governor Northam repeated much of what we had sent word for word. His endorsement put a huge jolt of energy into our efforts. And in the slide in the lower right corner is the Reverend Dr. Lakeisha Cook. She worked very closely with the Black Legislative Caucus to secure their endorsement for abolition. She also mobilized hundreds of Black clergy members around the state to call for an end to the death penalty. She worked with those local clergy to organize prayer vigils at execution and lynching sites in January of 2021 across the Commonwealth, and those generated huge media attention. I am absolutely convinced that the advocacy of the Black Legislative Caucus and those Black clergy members helped convince the governor to publicly embrace abolition as part of legal justice reform in Virginia. And I'm sure Rita will be telling us more about how that process unfolded. Now, during the General Assembly session, BADP mobilized a number of key voices at virtual hearings held by the House of Delegates and Senate. Over 20 murder victim family members, including those in these photographs, called for an end to capital punishment. Our victim spokesperson was Rachel Sutphin. She was the daughter of Corporal Eric Sutphin, who was murdered by Will Morva, the last person executed in Virginia. Rachel explained the many ways in which the death penalty failed her and other victim family members, only causing them more pain and more trauma. Another key factor was the emergence of a dozen Commonwealth attorneys who signed a letter calling for abolition of the death penalty. Together, these elected prosecutors represented 43% of the state's population. Their voices were joined by 3 former attorneys general and 5 former Commonwealth attorneys. Perhaps most significantly, the support of these prosecutors sidelined our biggest foe, the Virginia Association of Commonwealth Attorneys. With that group now no longer taking a position on abolition, there was virtually no one else left calling for retention of the death penalty. After death penalty abolition bills were passed in the committee in the House and Senate, the debate moved to the floors of each chamber. Our champions, Senator Servell and Delegate Mullen, were masterful in coordinating strategy and floor speeches. Delegate Mullen, an assistant prosecutor, talked about how worries of convicting innocent people for serious crimes kept him awake at night. Now, those few legislators who spoke for the death penalty were unable to address the 2 key issues of innocence or racial bias. Instead, all they could do was emotionally depict the brutality of high-profile homicides and insist that only death would bring justice to family members of victim families. Ironically, all 8 murder victim family members who served in the General Assembly voted for abolition. Senator Janet Howell directly challenged the argument that the death penalty helps victim family members with their own painful personal experience. She once spoke in a legislative committee hearing how the death penalty nearly destroyed her family when her father-in-law was murdered during a home invasion. In the House of Delegates, Chris Hurst and Mark Levine gave emotional speeches about the homicide of their loved ones and called for an end to capital punishment. After the final vote endorsing abolition, I was struck by a comment made by one of our key national allies, Laura Porter, the executive director of the 8th Amendment Project. She worked closely with us in the final weeks before and during the legislative session, offering support and advice based on other successful state abolition campaigns. Laura said she was surprised by how little supporters of the death penalty in Virginia fought against abolition. In other states, they forced politically difficult votes on the floor on the death penalty for killers of police officers, children, and multiple homicide victims. No such votes took place in Virginia. The opposition in the end seemed half-hearted at best. Perhaps this lack of enthusiasm for capital punishment is best explained by an illuminating quote from a Winchester Star newspaper article about a Senate committee vote by Republican Senator Jill Vogel for abolition. And I'm quoting from the story. Frederick County Republican Committee Chairman Alan Seibert said that the committee had not taken a position on the death penalty, noting that Republicans had varying opinions on the matter. Unquote. Now, this is a county that voted by an overwhelming 63% for Donald Trump as president in November of 2020. It says a lot that the local Republican committee in a solidly red locality like Frederick County was divided about the death penalty. Perhaps that is why not a single candidate in the recent statewide elections, either for the House of Delegates or for the 3 statewide offices, even mentioned the death penalty as a campaign issue. That is truly extraordinary, and it bodes well for defending our historic victory in Virginia.
Thank you, Michael. That was wonderful. And let me quickly exercise my moderator's prerogative to add that Christina Leslie, who was the VADP board chair you mentioned and whose op-ed you quoted, is a Washington and Lee law alum and also a VC3 alum. So yet another example of people from the clearinghouse going on to accomplish wonderful things in this area after law school. Let me now turn things over to Rita.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. This is a wonderful event, and It is truly my honor to be here amongst such distinguished panelists. I have to say at the outset that my remarks today are not certainly in my capacity as a political appointee of the Biden administration. So I do not talk on behalf or speak on behalf of the Biden administration, but want to sort of give you some insight into this process from the Patrick Henry side of the building and in my experiences assisting the governor with supporting this legislation. I'm going to back it up a little bit only because from the governor's office perspective, I think it's important to know that I think the journey to the Patrick Henry building support of this legislation began probably on the governor's first day in office. The governor early on in his administration, indeed even in his campaign, highlighted equity, especially for maternal health and housing issues and in early childhood education. Those were sort of his focus mainstays as we were coming in to the administration. I think that deepened tremendously in February of 2019 after the yearbook scandal. I think it was then that the governor did a very deep dive into understanding the racial inequity that still existed in Virginia and trying to understand the trauma and pain that pictures like that appeared in the yearbook caused people and the root of that pain. So he dug in and he started doing a lot of the work. He started educating himself and speaking with people and trying to really understand the history of the sort of the pain that those sort of images represented. And so by the November of 2019, we were very fortunate to have sort of the blue wave and gain the majority in both of the houses. There were a lot of really big initiatives folks wanted to get done. And so a lot of initiatives along equity took place and were sort of implemented and executed in the General Assembly of 2020. But I think the next wave of sort of realization came to the governor during the summer of 2020 in the social adjustment movements and the Black Lives Matter movements. And again, he was talking with activists and he was talking to victims' families and he was talking with law enforcement. Again, all in this, I think, this path to sort of enlightenment. And so I think, by the end of 2020, I think that everything, as I think our moderator said, sort of really aligned, right? You've got public opinion that certainly shows that it does not curry the favor in Virginia to impose the death penalty anymore. You've got legislators who've been primed by Mike's group to sort of think about this deeply. And you've got a governor who is deeply entrenched now in righting a lot of racial inequities in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And it all sort of culminates in the beginning of 2021. And the governor expressed for the first time, I think, publicly and more decidedly his support for the abolition in his State of the Commonwealth address. And so, the governor, I think, had been in contact with the patrons of these two bills. And, we began to work, as we often do, on legislation that the governor supports in tandem with the legislators to get ready to defend these bills in committees. And I don't often speak in committees on bills, but if it is something that the governor is extremely supportive of and extremely interested in, then I will appear in committee to express the administration's support. And I did so for these particular bills. And, it was amazing. One of the things that the governor's office does, and I don't think a lot of people know this, is its policy team works very closely with legislators, because of course they're the folks who actually carry the governor's order to get the legislation that the governor wants, the changes implemented across the finish line. So there's a long tradition of counsel's office and policy office working with legislators and their office and staff in session. And we did the same here. I mean, we had strategy sessions. Our folks helped prepare talking points. And what's really amazing about the 2021 session, I mean, if you've been a lobbyist or someone who's sort of familiar with how the Pocahontas building works, the pandemic really presented challenges to sort of lobbying and access. And so when you think about these committee hearings were held in large measure virtually. And so you don't have the access to, sort of schmooze with the legislators before they sit down or in between breaks and figure out who's there and who's going to speak. And sometimes before the pandemic, these committee sessions could go, a couple of hours because the committee chair was usually very adamant about letting everybody who showed up have a chance at the podium. But it was much more tightly constrained during the pandemic, simply because it was a virtual event, so you had to sign up in advance, and there was a limit on how many time, how long you could talk. But one of the benefits to having this sort of virtual event is everybody was a little bit more used to texting and sort of talking virtually as things went on. So, in addition to coordinating and collaborating with the legislators before committee meetings, we often had opportunities to collaborate with them during sessions or on the floor in the committees to sort of give them the lay of the land as things was progressing. And so, it was a wonderful experience to work with the legislators to get this sort of across the line. And when the governor signed the bill, the ceremonial signing in March, he did so at the Greenville Correctional Center, which was the last place where executions had been taking place in Virginia. And I was there. And one of the things we got to do before the ceremony was tour the execution chamber. And it was very, very sobering to see the execution chamber and the chair, and just imagine the number of lives that saw that particular perspective for the last time. So, it was perhaps, I think, one of the governor's greatest achievements to be a part of that process. And one of the things I wanted to mention, I don't know if you guys have seen the governor's official portrait, which was completed maybe 2 to 3 months ago, but it is a tradition. Thank you. For each Virginia governor to have his portrait painted. And typically what happens is the governor wants to highlight in that portrait things that meant a lot to him, like the important things he feels like he wants to convey about him and his administration. So if you look at Governor Northam's picture, you of course see the flag of Virginia there. You'll see a picture in the back that's like a sort of a water sort of landscape. The governor's from the Eastern Shore, so I'm sure that's a picture of the Eastern Shore. You'll see on the right hand a picture of a woman in a red blazer. That is the governor's wife. Kudos to the governor for being astute enough to know that's probably good for him to include her in his official portrait. Below her, you will see a bound book that looks, just sort of like your regular book, but I think it has COVID-19 on it. So the governor's sort of conveying that. And of course, one of the hallmarks of his administration was sort of guiding us through the mitigation measures that were needed to help us survive the pandemic. And then if you look in the corner, you'll see there are a couple of newspapers sitting there. I think there might be another picture that shows those a little close up. And so of all the many things that this governor accomplished over the course of 4 years, all of which were really pretty extraordinary things. I'm not going to list them off, but really landscape changing things. The two things he wanted to highlight for all of time that he helped accomplish was taking down the Confederate monument of Robert E. Lee and repealing the death penalty. So, it is amazing to me that we were part of something at the right moment in time, but it is also, a point of pride for me that of all the amazing things this governor's done, he wants the world to remember him for those two things. And that's how deeply and how sincerely he felt about that. And it didn't really dawn on me as we were sort of working through getting this legislation passed, how important it was for the world, or that the world was watching Virginia, until I came from a meeting one afternoon and my assistant said, you got a call from the ambassador of Australia. And I thought, that's really unusual. Usually they want to talk to the governor. And so I called the ambassador back, and what he wanted to know is he was fascinated by the fact that Virginia abolished the death penalty, and he wanted to know when the governor's going to sign the bill. And so, we give that the usual spiel when we get those calls is that, the governor's got it on his desk. He'll decide what he's going to do with it. But, I can't tell you exactly when he's going to sign it, but you could, confident he's going to sign it, but I don't know exactly when. And so the ambassador of Australia called me probably once a week, trying to figure out when the governor was going to sign the bill. And when the governor signed the bill, he called me afterward to say congratulations, and that he and a conglomeration of other countries were sort of watching and tracking the abolition of capital punishment across the world, and asked me to give his thanks and congratulations to the governor for Virginia's efforts in doing so. So, it sort of drove home to me that, these issues, although you get sort of mired down into the consequence of them within your backyard, but they are global issues. And Virginia was being observed and watched. And I'm glad that we did the right thing in the right moment. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Wonderful talks from each of you. We do have a question in the Q&A. So before I ask my own questions, I'll turn to that, and I'll invite the audience again to submit any additional questions that they have through the Q&A function. It looks like we have a little under 20 minutes left in our panel. But so that,
can I say something really quickly?
Oh, certainly. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, just to amplify the last point from Rita. I was interviewed by newspapers in the UK, Germany, Italy, and France leading up to abolition. And after it, I had virtual meetings with the embassy staff from 2 or 3 European countries that were just intrigued by what was happening in Virginia and the prospects of it happening elsewhere. So yeah, there was enormous interest globally, not just from Australia.
Well, and that's a fantastic segue into the question that Corinna Lane, who I know recently published an article with Doug Ramser about the work of the Capitol Defender offices and how successful they were in stopping Virginia's machinery of death and setting the groundwork for the repeal. Professor Lane has submitted a question that you just touched on briefly, Michael, which is, and it's directed to Doug, but I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this, which is whether this can be replicated elsewhere in other states. And I think sort of implicit in that question is how. So I would love to hear each of your thoughts about that.
Well, I guess I'll start. Like I said, I was a part of the Georgia Capitol Defender's Office at the beginning as well. And I think it was very much set up like Virginia's was, in that they were dedicated folks who were looking to fight really hard and had this esprit de corps that they were going to end the death penalty in Georgia, which is quite a battle to happen down there. I will tell you, in the beginning when I was in Georgia, I think we went 40 cases in a row with less than death results on clients. One thing I will say is that switched in Georgia. Things got highly politicized, and they went from sort of an independent public defender commission to one that was very much under the influence of politicians, and they changed the way they focused. And I think that affected it some about how independently. Virginia's done a great job of having an independent public defender system that was able to really support the Capitol Defender's Office when there was pressure for funding. Regularly, they were defended and kept free of that political process when it could have gotten that way, enabled us to do our work free of any repercussions or concern about the politics of it. You have to have that. That being said, when we see in Georgia, the number of new death sentences in Georgia has plummeted exactly the same way as it has in Virginia. We've seen Capitol Defender offices now springing up in Texas and very, very active death penalty jurisdictions around the country, and we're seeing the same thing. We are seeing the number of new death sentences really precipitously decline throughout any of them when you're just giving that. So I think as long as you put them together well and you put dedicated people who specialize in doing it, you don't overtax those resources, but support them. Certainly in terms of Capitol Defender offices, I think they're going to continue to have the same effect throughout the whole country. If we can do that, I think it's easily something that can be replicated and should be around. I hope they'll learn lessons of that.
Yeah, Just one comment, and this again goes to Rita's point about the courage of Governor Northam on this issue, that Nevada last year was very, very close to abolishing the death penalty. And the only difference between Nevada and Virginia is that in Virginia, the governor endorsed abolition. In Nevada, essentially, the governor put up a stop sign and stopped the legislature from abolishing, saying he didn't think it was time. And they thought that our friends in Nevada had the votes in one, definitely in one chamber, and the other, they were very close in the other. And if the governor had endorsed, they would have abolished last year. And unfortunately, the governor there lost his resolve at the last minute and didn't have the courage to bring it over the finish line. So that just shows how crucial the governor is in the political process of abolishing the death penalty. That being said, we're hopeful that Nevada may in another year or two be able to bring the bill over the finish line, either convincing this governor or a subsequent governor to take that step. We're not very far away, I don't think, in Utah. I think another state that has a real possibility is Ohio. So I think that there are more and more states that are coming into play, states that are either purple or are red. And you know, I think that we're going to have more states. I mean, and if you go back to the chart that I had in my presentation, every couple of years in the last 15, 20 years, a new state has been added to the abolition cause. Most recently, Colorado, New Hampshire, Delaware, Washington, all those states, I think, in the last 5 years. So the momentum is on our side, and it's going to continue.
Yeah, Michael, I should have mentioned Colorado, because I think they're another example, just like Virginia, of where really good defense attorneys impacted that a lot. The James Holmes theater shooting case out there that was incredibly high profile, that resulted in a life sentence for James Holmes, I think had a huge impact on abolition and ultimately those votes in Colorado to abolish out there.
So typically in a symposium such as this, I would try to avoid injecting partisan politics, but I think there's a little bit of an elephant in the room here. Rita briefly mentioned the sort of blue wave that swept through Virginia leading up to 2021, and the list of states that Michael just gave us about the most recent repeals, or I think sort of ticking through them as you read them. I think they're all blue states. New Hampshire, I guess, is maybe a little more purplish. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts about really how that blue wave, the election of the fact that Democrats took control of the governor's mansion as well as both chambers of the legislature, how important, how significant that was in Virginia, as well as sort of Virginia's changing demographics. Any thoughts on that issue? I guess I'll direct that to Michael first.
Oh, well, VEDP has worked really, really hard to make death penalty abolition a nonpartisan issue. Because for many, many years, it was clear we would never be able to get it over the finish line without some Republican support. And even with the blue wave, we worked really hard to get votes on the Republican side of the aisle. The vote for abolition in Virginia in 2021 would have been much more bipartisan if we had not gotten stuck in an unrelated inter-party scuffle. We had, I think, 5 Republican senators ready to vote for abolition. But what happened is very late in the game, the Republican caucus decided to push for an amendment to the abolition bill to strip judges of any authority to reduce any capital murder conviction to anything less than life in prison without parole. And that ended up costing us Republican votes, including, I mean, Senator Bill Stanley, one of the most conservative Republicans in the Senate, was a co-patron of the abolition bill. He ended up abstaining in committee and on the floor because his amendment to strip judges of that authority was not included because Senator Surville, the patron, the chief patron, decided he didn't need Republican votes. And unfortunately, I thought it was, even though it might have been unfortunate for a handful of cases, politically, that would have been more helpful for us long-term in defending the victory by making it more of a bipartisan effort. And in the House, two Republicans, Delegate Jeff Campbell from Marion and Delegate Kerry Coyner from Chesterfield County, did vote for abolition in the House. So, and those votes are particularly important this year, that there was a bill to reinstate the death penalty for police murders. And unfortunately, the horrible killings of the Bridgewater law enforcement officers illustrate, put a big boost into efforts to pass that measure. It was defeated on a party line vote in the Senate, in a Senate committee, but in the House, it was never brought to a vote because there weren't enough votes, despite it being in Republican hands, to pass either the committee or the floor, because we have at least 3, if not 5 or 6 Republican delegates who oppose reinstatement of the death penalty for any reason.
Given that, and the importance of then reaching across the aisle and in other states, working with Republican-controlled legislatures, I'm curious about what you have found in your advocacy and lobbying efforts to be the most sort of persuasive arguments, or the arguments that are that more conservative-minded legislators are more receptive to.
I think by far and away, the most important 2 issues are innocence. Even the most ardent death penalty supporter, with the exception of a handful of lunatics, will not say that it's okay to execute an innocent person. Believe it or not, there are a handful of Virginia legislators who sort of shrug and say, well, that's the price of the criminal justice system. If we execute a handful of innocent people along the way, well, that's the cost of doing business. But the vast majority of conservatives are appalled by that. And curiously, the leadership of former Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli in the Thomas Haynesworth case made a huge impression on a whole generation of Republican lawmakers. His fight for Thomas Haynesworth to clear his name of rape convictions, despite the lack of DNA evidence in a couple of cases, and championing his case publicly, arguing before the Virginia Supreme Court in that case, and in bringing him to speak at crime victim summits, made a really big impression on a lot of Republicans. So that innocence issue is huge. Another issue that I hear a lot from Republicans is that there's cognitive dissonance by being anti-abortion and pro-death penalty. And that desire to be morally consistent is important to a number of Republican lawmakers. And it certainly, I think, is absolutely true for Kerry Coyner, for Bill Stanley, and a number of other Republican legislators.
And you mentioned there, Michael, the bill, I guess it was last week, for a limited reinstatement for the killing of law enforcement officers, and the horrible timing of the the Bridgewater killings. I think the night before that bill was to be heard. What is the outlook in terms of repealing the repeal efforts, and how do we play defense against any effort to bring the death penalty back in Virginia?
Well, thankfully, we have some really good partners that are there, as well as us, at least for the time being. The ADP may go out of existence later this year, sort of up to the board and how our fundraising efforts go to decide whether or not we can really keep going or not. Essentially, I think the key is just maintaining and increasing Republican opposition to reinstatement, because I don't think we have to worry about the Democratic side, of people wanting to go back. Once we got Dick Sassler on our side, I don't think any other Democrat is going to even think about reinstating the death penalty. On the Republican side, we just need to keep Republicans we already have that are with us, and to continue. We're really focusing our efforts on talking to the newly elected group of Republicans. There were about, I think, 10 or 12 that were newly elected, and we're trying to meet with each and every one of them to advocate for retaining abolition. And at least in 2 of those cases, we have gotten pretty strong indications that those 2 do not want to reinstate the death penalty. So we're hoping to continue that and talk to more newly elected Republicans to try to get them also in that place. And we were told some inside baseball by that the bill to reinstate the death penalty for police killings was discussed in the Republican caucus in the House of Delegates. And this is a direct quote. One of the Republicans told us that there was opposition from, quote, legislators in the East, unquote, against reinstatement, either that they personally didn't want to see it, or they didn't want to take what they thought of such a politically fraught vote to reinstate.
I have one last question, really, and I'll direct it, Rita, to you first if I can, but I'd love to get each of your thoughts on this. And that is that, now that we have repealed the death penalty in Virginia, and of course, there were a number of other wonderful legislative accomplishments in the 2021 session, but I would love to get each of your thoughts sort of on what the next priorities should be in the areas of criminal justice reform, as well as racial justice reform. Our last panel ended with a discussion about, now that the death penalty's gone, where do we channel our energy now? And I would certainly love to hear each of your thoughts about that.
Thank you. So one of the things I try not to do on panels, considering my current political appointment, is to talk too much about politics. So I'm going to abstain from answering the question directly, if you would allow me to do that. But say I think there's a lot of work to be done still in Virginia along equity lines. But I'm glad to see that there are a lot of voices out there, people who don't necessarily or have not necessarily grown up with the inequities are out there fighting those. And so I think that's what we need. And I'm glad to see that is happening in Virginia.
Thank you.
I would say that, one of the things that I learned in the Capital Defender's Office to try to show people was that our clients were not just the worst thing they'd ever done. They were more human, and they were more people than that, and you humanize them. And I think we've forgotten that in a lot of criminal stuff now, when we have life without parole and taken away a lot of options for people to have second chances. I think doing away with mandatory minimums, trying to bring back the opportunities for people to demonstrate their redemption, right? And they're not the same people that were sentenced, are really important things to show. One of the things we focused on in the Capital Defender's Office was mental health issues and how they impacted our clients. And I still see that affecting more than just death penalty cases. They're throughout, that we need to show how those traumas that people are experiencing, the mental health issues throughout their lives, is what really is at play here, and treating those with an idea towards rehabilitating people to restoring them back to society rather than just being punitive, and demonstrating mercy for those. I think there's still a lot of work that can be done on that, and that's what we should be looking forward to.
Michael, anything to add on this subject?
I think a really important issue, and maybe the preeminent human rights issue in terms of criminal justice in Virginia, solitary confinement. Again, this movie's sort of dated, but the Tom Hanks film, Castaway, where he's alone on a desert island, and you see his mental health fracture. That happens far too often in solitary confinement in Virginia and in many other states, where whatever they call it, solitary confinement, administrative segregation, and other ridiculous euphemisms, people are held alone in cells for weeks, months, even years at a time. And people, if they do not have mental health issues to begin with, get them very quickly in solitary confinement. And I think that's probably, at least from the religious community that I'm very much a part of, that is a crucial issue that many people of faith have been working on for many, 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 many years and are continuing to fight for. And it was an excellent op-ed that was published, I think, in the Times-Dispatch last week on that subject. And I would really recommend people look for it online.
Wonderful. Well, this brings us to 12:46. So we were very much on target for our 12:45 end time. I'd really like to thank each of you for the time that you set aside to prepare for this symposium and the time you gave us this morning. I really enjoyed listening to you all, but more fundamentally, I want to thank you all for the work that you did in each of your individual capacities to bring about this incredible result that we achieved last year. And I hope that you have all found some time. Doug and Michael, I know that you have, because I did it with you, but I hope you've all found some time to savor this remarkable victory. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
It's great being with you.
Thank you.
And I'll just echo Professor Engel. Thank you guys all for joining us and bringing your unique perspectives to this important conversation.